a consulting firm called First International Resources. My question is about the upcoming Ukrainian elections. Have you seen any sort of, back in the last presidential election, there was sort of the general idea that the Kremlin was supporting Yanukovych and that the Western countries had an interest or not supporting, but were interested in seeing the Orange Coalition come out on top. And now, the presidential and parliamentary elections are coming up. Have you seen any sort of support coming out of the Kremlin or the U.S. administration? Is there just a keen interest? Are they waiting to see how it shakes out? Is there just frustration on the part of the Yushchenko-Tymoshenko feuding? But is there any sort of a general sort of view on the part of the administration or the Kremlin on the upcoming elections? And is it something that might be on Vice President Biden's agenda at the end of the month? Thanks.
I think Vice President Biden will probably meet with many of the candidates that are coming forward at this point. Probably not all, because there will be 25 or 30 candidates, and you probably won't meet all of them. However, as you say, certainly the Americans, we will be interested. We'll be interested. We're not going to pick favorites. We're certainly not going to try to influence this election. This is something for the Ukrainians to do, and they've shown they can do it well. They've shown they can do elections. That's one of their main accomplishments of the last 3 or 4 years, is good, clean, internationally observed and approved elections. So they can do this. And as long as it's a free and fair and clean election, I'm sure that the American government will work with the president that comes out of it. Now, I don't know about the Russians, but Steve was there recently and can say whether or not they've picked a favorite.
I would just add, I agree completely with Bill on how I think the U.S. government is going to approach this election. And I would just go back to 2003, 2004, before the 2004 election. I think you were in Afghanistan at the time, but I remember I was still in the government, and I had a conversation with Carlos Pascual, who had Bill's job as the assistance coordinator, and John Herbst, who was our ambassador in Kyiv at the time. And we actually asked ourselves, certainly within the U.S. government, there was a sense that Yushchenko represented a vision that was consistent with what we wanted to see for Ukraine. And we actually asked us, should we find ways and look to ways to support Yushchenko above and beyond just supporting a free and fair election? And we decided no. And 2 reasons. One, it wasn't the right thing to do. But 2, we said even if we were going to set that aside, we weren't sure whether an American endorsement or American help would help or hurt Yushchenko. So we decided it was best to stay out of this. And I suspect that same sort of reasoning is going to apply this time. Now, on the question of Russia, I'm not sure if the Russians, they seem to be doing something of a version of sort of holding out the hand to various candidates. I mean, it seems like when Tymoshenko and Yanukovych are in Moscow, they have extended conversations there. I'm not sure that we've seen the Russians positioning themselves to openly endorse one candidate or the other. And they also may have learned a lesson from 2004, where they fairly openly supported Yanukovych, and I suspect in the end that probably hurt Yanukovych. So the Russians may be certainly talking to a variety of candidates, but I'm not sure that you're going to see the Moscow openly push for one candidate over another.
Any further questions? Ihor, go.
Ihor, Gawdiak, Ukrainian-American Coordinating Council. A few weeks before President Obama went to Russia and announced his upcoming trip, some Ukrainian organizations appealed to their members to urge the president to stop on the way, either on the way to Moscow or coming from Moscow in Kyiv, believing that this would send a signal both to Ukraine and the world in general that American policy toward Ukraine hasn't changed in spite of the restarts of relations between U.S. and Russia. My question to you is, do you think that there would have been some merit in such a stop in Kyiv by the president, or would it actually have sent a negative signal implying that Ukraine and Russia are very closely tied in American relations? Ambassador Taylor first, because I know Ambassador Pifer.
We don't.
When I was in Kyiv, Ukrainians always knew where the visitor from Washington was coming from, whether he was coming directly from Washington and going back to Washington, or whether he was coming from Washington en route to somewhere else. And Ukrainians, like all other nations, like to feel that the visitor is coming to see them and coming to have, the visitor cares about what is happening in that country, cares about the views of the president, the prime minister, and others. So going there on the way to or from seems to me to be less good than what the vice president's doing. The vice president is going on to Georgia, but he's not going to Moscow. Jim Steinberg, when he visited early in this administration, the Deputy Secretary of State, and he came from Washington and went back to Washington. So I think I focus on the country. Now, it's always good to have the President of the United States show up in your country. So if he happens to do that, that's just fine. But it's better if it's an opportunity to really focus on that country, not be a sideshow.
I think you know my answer. I mean, as we discussed when this came up, I guess about a month and a half ago. At the time, I thought it was just, not doable in terms of getting the president to go to Kyiv. So I argued instead for getting the vice president to go to Kyiv, and I'm glad to see the vice president is going. I mean, I do expect that President Obama will go to Kyiv at an appropriate time. I hope it can be on a standalone trip, because I think if you look in the past, it usually tends to be on the way to and from Moscow, and that sends a bit of a message which maybe we don't want to be sending. But I think it's also, though, a very important signal of American interest in and support for Ukraine that the vice president is going.
All right. Are there any further questions? Yes, please.
Okay, Tatiana Vorashko, Voice of America. The first reports by Russian newspapers of Obama visit in Moscow were characterized by Reuters as lukewarm. Especially emphasis was given to the lack of support by ordinary Russians to Obama, or they were not greeting him like in Cairo or like in Prague. So, in your opinion, did it meet expectation of Obama administration regarding the visit? Was it expected to see some, greeting or warmer meeting by, I'm sorry, I'm very thirsty. So if you can just go ahead and answer the question.
I would just say that I imagine that the administration and the team around President Obama would like to have had his remarks given at the university this morning broadcast on the main TV show in Russia. This was apparently not done. It was on one of the less watched stations. So I guess that's the way of saying that there is a great influence of the central government in Russia on the perceptions of people, and that's understandable. But President Obama is very good when he's able to speak to Egyptians, for example, or Germans, or Europeans more broadly. And he was very good speaking to Russians. And the more Russians who are able to see that and listen to him and have him directly address them, I think the better.
Yeah, I would just say that I think, remember the context too, is that you have had in Russia, I guess for the last several years now, by virtually all accounts, the major Russian broadcast media giving a fairly consistently anti-American message. And President Obama is not going to change that overnight. Now, if in fact the two sides are able to build upon the relationship that they seem to have established yesterday, at some point it's very hard for the Russian government to, on the one hand, be sort of broadcasting an anti-American message when they're doing lots of deals with the United States. So that may chip away. And I think to the extent that President Obama's remarks get circulated, that can have an impact, because I think he really did make an effort there to reach out, and while explaining differences between the American and Russian governments, but he did try to make an effort to reach out to the Russian people there.